Over the past 60 years, Marc Connelly has, at one time or another, been a playwright, producer, director, and actor. He's one of the last remaining grand old men of the Broadway theater. In the early 20s, writing in collaboration with George S. Kaufman, he turned out such Broadway hits as Dulcy, Merton of the Movies, and Beggar on Horseback. But it was his solo effort as author of Green Pastures which brought him his greatest fame and the Pulitzer Prize for Drama in 1930. The play was later made into a movie and was twice adapted for television. His talents as a writer have not been limited to the stage and screen. He's also the author of prize-winning short stories, a novel, and a book of memoirs entitled Voices Off Stage. With all, he's found time to teach playwriting at Yale and to serve as president of the Authors League and of the National Institute of Arts and Letters. Mr. Connelly, in your memoirs, you say, "My love for the theater has grown with the familiarity of its mysteries, or with its mysteries." What are the mysteries of the theater to you?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know what's behind any hypnosis, really. What the psychological pressures are that come up in you that makes you. But the theater is, to me, well, it's a cathedral. As I said in those memoirs.
For worship?
Pardon?
For worship?
Oh, yes. It was, well, it began as a church, you know. The first records we have of any theater are the ancient Greek plays that were put on al fresco on the way to the Dionysian shrines. And there was always an altar in the middle of the thing. And the occasion, the play, the dance, whatever it was that they gave, was a device to invite the god to come into the worshipers. And it was always been an invitation to be inhabited by a deity.
It's more difficult to think of it as a cathedral today. I think of some of the modern trends,
I wish more people did, because today's theater it's a little difficult to identify it as theater. It's a place of explosion. It's a place of, well, it's still a place of entertainment, and I'm not denigrating the word entertainment because it has to be entertaining. That was I once found myself defining theater as a place where one sought truth under pleasant circumstances, and I think that's what it always was. The Greek theater, the popular ancient Greek theater, was a wonderful catharsis. It was a great way in which to more or less purge yourself of the humdrum things that preoccupied your time. It released them and gave you a chance to examine contemporary morals and mores. It had an excitement that has never died, really.
Would it be a place for us to increase our understanding of ourselves?
That's what that was the idea. It was medicine too.
Medicine in what way?
Well, the Greeks, as you know, built a great many theaters on the sites of what they call the Asclepion, the hospitals. And in the days of Hippocrates, and afterwards when they had hydrotherapy amongst bits of magic, they always put up a theater because they knew that the clown and the mime was just as much of a doctor as the physicians. And it was a medicine for the spirit and the soul.
Certainly comedy is.
Oh, you haven't got comedy, you haven't got theater.
What about theater as a polemic, a place where the playwright argues his case?
I think it almost invariably has at least a vague didactic purpose behind it, though when it's used consciously.
But vague?
Yes, it should be vague. Whenever it becomes specific, and whenever it becomes, when what it attacks is identified, it loses some of its magic as theater, I think, and then you might as well be in a classroom hearing a lecture, because the playwright should not be a hortatory. He shouldn't be a lecturer. He's a means of transmission.
You've also written that the theater must have freedom to function properly. And I think that's pretty generally understood. But what about today? Freedom seems almost to have moved toward license. I think of...
Well, it is a licentious theater, unhappily. And I'm against all the dirtier vulgarities for the reason that they become boring. They are...
It's one of the worst sins of theater, is to bore the audience.
Well, of course it is, and they're, to my mind, they're just as stultifying and just as dull as if a man stood up and kept reciting one word for an hour and a half. And the youngsters in the theater who are writing the, quote, plays, close quotes, are after detonations more than, I think, expressions. They don't want the...
Shock.
Yes, they want noise and shock. It's an explosive instrument right now. It's just as bad as the old dynamite canes. When
maybe the
I
only
was
way
a
to
boy.
catch attention in a world where...
Pardon?
Maybe the only way to catch attention in the world where there are so many detonations on the one hand.
Well, there's a little thing called skill and craft and invention and imagination. I don't think that what is being offered today are necessarily substitutes for those. An audience has always wanted it. Man's always needed the theater. He knows that it is a marvelous tonic. And every time a play that has any worth, any skill, any art in it, any time that kind of play comes along, everybody rushes there. So they were actually going to a kind of a confessional.
Are you a theater goer today?
Oh yes, oh yes. I feel that I ought to wear a gas mask sometimes, but I've had good times this winter. I've enjoyed.
You have seen things that you've liked.
Oh yes, this winter. Oh yes. Let me see if I can name some of them offhand. I like The Good Doctor, for instance. I think that was a very underestimated play. I think it had much more craft and skill and personality. It had individuality. That is the one thing about a play that I look for. Is this the first time the curtain's ever gone up on any play? That's what I ask myself. And if I have that, if I get a satisfactory answer, then I carry away, well, an increase of some kind to what small stature I have.
You were literally born into the theater. Your mother and father were both, before your birth,
yes,
members
mother,
of a touring company.
My mother eloped with my father when he was a handsome young Irish leading man in a stock company in Boston. And my mother was the daughter of a very prominent Bostonian. She left a note one day. She had been told that young Mr. Connelly was not necessarily welcome because he was a Catholic, among other things, in a high church Episcopalian area. And my mother didn't say that my father was a renegade Catholic, but he was.
But he was.
Oh yes, he didn't do much about church. But anyway, she left a little note saying she was going away with Joseph, and they had some time to figure out who Joseph was until he was that actor. And
that didn't set well.
Oh no, but after a while, notices began arriving from various newspaper drama criticism, and it turned out that their daughter was a wonderful actress. And somehow that began to catalyze them. And as the notices were increasingly good when they came from Shreveport or Chillicothe or Duluth, they realized that perhaps Joseph wasn't such a bad husband for Mabel. And so they had a very happy life together. My manager.
They had settled down by the time you were born, settled down in McKeesport,
well, they had a baby girl who died of pneumonia when they were up in Minnesota. And
on tour.
On tour, and the shock was so great, and their sense of guilt was so great, having contributed to the baby's death, presumably died of a cold, that they gave up the theater, and at the behest of my father's people and my maternal grandparents, they settled down in a little town just outside Pittsburgh. My father went into the hotel business there. He knew so many actors that he had a ready-made clientele, and the actors who came to Pittsburgh to perform would always come up to McKeesport and stay at my father's hotel.
So young Marcus Cook Connelly grew up with actors all around him.
I became that abomination, a hotel child. I was told to, not to go into any rooms of any of the clients of the hotel. There was one gentleman who tolerated me. I usually arrived when he was shaving. I don't know whether that made my greeting any warmer, but I used to go and talk to him about the Civil War, old Billy Means, and he would stop shaving when he would see that I was really intent on hearing everything he said. He'd tell me about this battle and that battle. And apparently, as Lloyd Lewis once said, if you could come out of it alive, the Civil War was one of the most enjoyable experiences that a young man could have.
You met Buffalo Bill at this time,
I did indeed. Oh, yes, that's the hand. A little worn now, but that's the hand that one day shook his as my father allowed me to be a waiter. It was an astounding occasion. I'd never been allowed to do such a thing. I took a glass of grape juice up to Mr. Cody. Now, Mr. Cody, you know, had an enormous reputation for drinking anything but grape juice, but that's what he was on the wagon then. I guess he was, they just sort of moved in on him to restrain him, and his circus was in town, and I was able to bring him a glass of grape juice on a tray, and I had very little breath. But he said, "Come here, young man, what's your name?" I told him, and he said, "Well, it's good to see you, and it's good to meet you." So I met Buffalo Bill. Nothing really.
So it was almost inevitable.
Just a miracle, that was
yes, almost inevitable, I suppose, that you'd go into the theater, given that
well,
kind of background.
I had a theater on the second floor of my father's hotel, where I produced contemporary drama from my own pen.
At what age?
Oh, I was 8, and sometime, I guess in my 9th year, I was still doing it. They were usually sociological studies. A brave sailor, for instance, when the ship caught fire, he saved everybody's life. And then I was once a master detective, too, running down crime. It's one of the studies in depth of crime. I remember the Biddle boys who escaped from the Western Pennsylvania prison, penitentiary. They eloped with the prison keeper's wife, and it became quite a dramatic,
very heavy drama,
running story in the newspapers for a long time.
You lost your father when you were about 12 years old.
Yes, I was. He died in 1902. I was 11 when he died. Yes, one of those curious, unbelievable, those incredibilities. You lose your father when you're 11. It's the most frightening kind of bankruptcy. You just don't have anything in the world for a while, and you walk around in a kind of a daze. And anyway, my mother was widowed, ran a hotel until the Panic of 1908, which a good many of your listeners, I don't think, will recall. That came along, and she lost the hotel, so I had to go to work instead of continuing my prep school life and going to
You'd
Harvard.
intended to go to Harvard then?
Yes, I was the first of several generations in my family who didn't go to Harvard.
So you went to Pittsburgh instead of Harvard? And,
I went to Pittsburgh, yes.
Got a job.
It was not known as the University City then.
Yes.
I worked on a newspaper there, collecting classified ads, I remember.
What was the first thing you wrote when you began to write for theater? It was in Pittsburgh, but the Athletic Association, wasn't
Yes,
it?
the Pittsburgh Athletic Association, of which I was the theater director. It consisted of once a month getting together some kind of a show. And my collaborator was a musical play we did. My collaborator was the famous Zoel Parento.
Oh, yes.
Who wasn't as universally famous as he should have been. He was a very fine musician and a very fine composer. We wrote a musical play which was done at one of the big theaters in Pittsburgh, and to everyone's astonishment did about $18,000 on the week.
Was this The Lady of Luzon?
That was The Lady of Luzon. You're probably the only living person outside of my old friend Bert Mustin, whom I see on TV occasionally. He was in it. He would remember. But that encouraged a local millionaire to believe that Mr. Parento and I ought to do something a little more ambitious. So we wrote a show and came to New York. And it probably was the greatest employment agency for rewrite people that was ever existed. The trains to Boston, when we were trying out up there, every train brought in a half a dozen expert librettists.
You've been quoted as saying that everyone who owned a typewriter took a hand in the writing of it.
Is there a rewrite man here? Well, the crush would have killed the average person.
And that show wasn't successful, was it? But it,
well, not quite, no. It got...
that was the Amber Empress, wasn't it?
It was the Amber Empress, and that was the title of what I had written, but of course everybody in the world had rewritten it by then. Instead of being a 16th century story of the building of a villa on the River Brenta and the love affair between a doge and a young woman, it became a story, sort of a natural sequence, I guess. It became a story of a motion picture company working in Venice.
So you were stuck in New York.
I was stuck in New York. I didn't have enough money to go back to Pittsburgh, so I sponged on a friend who had been a fellow reporter with me on the Pittsburgh Dispatch, and who is now in the advertising business. Not a big mogul, but he had a living wage enough to support the two of us.
And you met George S. Kaufman at this time, then? When
Well, then not then. Eventually, I got a job doing legwork for Reynold Wolfe, who had a theatrical column in the Daily Telegraph, which in those days was a half theatrical paper, and the rest was sports. I met George. We would be together with our arms on the plush back railing of a dozen theaters, and we became familiar with each other and began talking and became friends, and each discovered that the other wanted to write plays, and so we said, let's go ahead and write a play. And then we met a manager on our daily rounds named George Tyler, who was then a very important figure in the New York theater. And he was a bold fellow, too, and he allowed us each to write a play. I rewrote an old comic opera called Erminie with the Wolf Opera and James Powers, I remember. It was the first thing I ever had done in New York. I was up at the Old Circle Theater, and the young fellow who did the scenery, which was extraordinarily attractive, in shades of gray, believe it or not, a young man named Norman Bell Geddes.
Yes.
And that was his debut, too. And George rewrote a comedy that was killed more or less by the flu epidemic. And I remember an ad he wanted Mr. Tyler to take. Avoid crowds. Go see someone in the house at Knickerbocker Theater.
Then your first collaboration with him was on a play that was written for a young English actress named Lynn Fontanne.
Yes, Mr. Tyler was her manager, and she was then playing ingenue roles with Lorette Taylor and her husband. Isn't this appalling? Now I can't think of his name. Elizabeth Taylor, Rhett Taylor's husband's name. Well, I hope his ghost doesn't arise and haunt me, because we were very good friends. Anyway, the two of them, star and writer husband, decided that Lynn should have more of a chance than he could possibly give her in writing plays for his wife to star in. So Tyler agreed, and he suggested that George and I cook up a play, so we did. We wrote a play called Dulcy.
Which was a hit.
Yes, thank goodness. And Lynn became an established figure, and about 6 months later, she married a young man named Alfred Lunt.
Yes. Then you wrote To the Ladies for Helen Hayes, and you collaborated on Deep Tangled Wildwood, Merton of the Movies. But after several years of
Merton of
collaboration...
the Movies are going to do into a musical.
Is that right?
I just heard, yes. I don't know who's doing it.
Several years of collaboration, why you no longer worked with George Kaufman. You were still friends. Why did you break up the collaboration?
We only stopped public collaboration. We always were. If I wrote anything, I showed it to George, and George usually showed me what he was doing. And as a matter of fact, just before he died, we were going to do another play together under our joint names. But I wanted to do a play. I did a play called Wisdom Tooth alone to see whether I could possibly get through a play under my own devices. And George wanted to do a play of his own. He wrote The Butter and Egg Man. And George immediately went back to collaboration because he was, he knew he had an enormous aptitude for collaboration. And well, he had an aptitude for a great many things, but collaborating seemed to speed up his adrenaline, and I don't have to point out that he was enormously successful. I wrote a good many plays alone. I didn't have much success with them. I had success with some, but anyway, we'd do skits and all sorts of sort of semi-amateur collaborations together.
You, of course, had one great success. Do you recall the evening of February 26, 1930, the night that Green Pastures opened?
I do indeed. It was the night after the apple cart opened. And I thought, oh, what are they going to do to me? Because the critics didn't like the apple cart. And
you feared they wouldn't like Green Pastures as well?
Oh, I was pretty well certain that they wouldn't. And the producer, who was a very gallant gentleman, who had made a fortune on Wall Street, and by some kind of ESP, managed to get out of Wall Street about 15 minutes before the crash, with all his money intact. And I don't know, maybe he wanted to do as an act of contrition or something, but he went into the theater and looking around for a play, and as a matter of fact, he was playing bridge with George Kaufman one night, and he was asking George how to play, and George says, no, but Connelly's got a new one.
Which you hadn't been able to get produced for well over a year.
Every manager in town had turned it down, yes.
Controversial?
No, terror, I think, set in the moment they read it, when they discovered it was a play with an entirely Negro cast and the character God to be played by a Negro. That sort of discouraged any deep attention to what the script might have in the way of merit. But Arthur, oh dear, great producer, he did dozens and dozens of the best plays of the late 20s and the 30s. Oh, isn't that awful? These lacunae you get in your head sometimes.
What happened when the curtain went down?
Well, I want to tell you about this. One man who said, I've read the play twice, and if I knew how to do it, I would do it. And I know he meant it too. Oh, dear, what's his name? I hope it comes to me before I'm off the air.
Let me ask you again what happened that night when the curtain went down at the end of the last
Well,
day.
when the curtain went down, the audience indicated that we had a hit, all right.
Just virtually exploded.
Oh, yes, it did. They were rebuilding the roof for weeks afterward. But I was in a state of shock, a state of exhaustion, too, because I'd been working day and night on the rehearsal. I directed it. And getting the curtain up had been really a strain that almost knocked me out. My partner, my producer, had nothing but confidence. It was terrifying to see his ebullience and to see his belief that the play was really going to be big. He says, and if we go to jail, he says, I think it'll be a nice thing to do. It'll be quite an honor to go to jail, because we thought we might. You know, we didn't dare open it out of town for the reason that we didn't feel there would be the same tolerance possibly in Philadelphia or Boston that there might be in New York. We hoped for, and because it would an awful lot of quidnuncs would see it as a sacrilegious, horrible piece of latter-day deviltry, you know. Instead of which, thank goodness, every one of the Orthodox churches found that it was essentially quite simple and quite innocent, and as a matter of fact, even reverent. So. We never had
You've said that one of your purposes in writing it in the introduction was to offset the loss of interest in religion, that so many of your generation were become agnostic. Well, but you yourself were and have remained an agnostic.
Yes, certainly. I felt I was a sort of a pantheist in the sense that I was perfectly ready to entertain the merits and recognize and honor the merits of any religion. Almost any religion that lasts 500 years is a pretty good religion, you know, until the police move in, police sergeants and the people that start shoving the believers around and begin offering such stringent restrictions that it's no longer fun. And I think that the general idea of God would provide for a certain amount of amusement on his part, too, an intolerance that most of the religions don't dare offer.
Thank you very much.